Rubidgea was one of the largest and deadliest predators of the Permian Period, the time that directly preceded the Age of Reptiles and the reign of the dinosaurs. It was a member of the clade Gorgonopsia, the first saber-toothed predators. From the side, Rubidgea didn't look that different from Inostrancevia, the most famous Gorgonopsian. However, Rubidgea was much more robust than its more well-known cousin, with a dramatically wider skull. Gorgonopsians such as Rubidgea were synapsids, meaning they were part of the group of animals more closely related to mammals than to reptiles. Although often called mammal-like reptiles, Gorgonopsians technically belonged to neither group, but did possess a combination of features commonly associated with them. Rubidgea lived during the late Permian, when synapsids were the dominant fauna, and had already come to resemble mammals much more than their reptile-like ancestors. All Rubidgea fossils originate from Africa, with most coming from the highly productive South African Karoo supergroup. It records a period of over 100 million years, with all Rubidgea fossils found within the cystocephalous and daptocephalous assemblage zones, which together span most of the late Permian. It was found in 1938 and named after Sidney Rubidge, whose grandson, paleontologist Bruce Sidney Rubidge, has since become one of the most prolific modern researchers of the Karoo supergroup. Multiple species of Rubidgea have been named over the years, but only one, Rubidgea atrox, is currently considered valid. Even this designation is somewhat tentative, as it has been suggested Rubidgea atrox could be reclassified as a species of the closely related Gorgonopsian genus Dinogorgon. To make matters even more confusing, the type species of Dinogorgon is named Dinogorgon Rubidgeae. To further add to the confusion, an extinct plant shares the name Rubidgea. While rare, organisms sharing genus names is permitted so long as they are from different kingdoms. The plant Rubidgea was a glossopterid seed fern, and is also found in the Karoo supergroup. Fossils of the Gorgonopsian Rubidgea originating from Tanzania may represent a second species, Rubidgea maxima. While they remain undescribed, these East African bones include postcranial remains, whereas nearly all specimens of Rubidgea atrox consist entirely of skulls, which is an unfortunate common quirk of Permian fossils from the Karoo supergroup. Rubidgea is the namesake of Rubidgeinae, a subclade of Gorgonopsia which includes Dinogorgon and about a half dozen other species, most of whom were contemporaries of Rubidgea. It and the other members of the clade had widened skulls and round, bony protrusions called bosses above their eyes. Rubidgeines are currently exclusively known from Africa. This is most likely a result of preservation bias, as most of the world's landmasses were combined into the supercontinent of Pangaea at the time, but the vast majority of preserved late Permian terrestrial fossils, and all named species of Gorgonopsians, originate from either Africa or Russia. That said, there is a strong degree of endemism between the two regions. Most of the other African Gorgonopsians are more closely related to Rubidgeinae than to the Russian Gorgonopsians, which appear to form their own clade called Inostrancevinae. This Russian clade naturally includes Inostrancevia, who was once thought to be the northern ecological equivalent of Rubidgea. However, a species of Inostrancevia has recently been identified in Africa, showing that the divide between the northern and southern Gorgonopsians was not absolute. Without a described postcranial skeleton, the exact size of Rubidgea is unclear. The largest Rubidgea skull has a length of 45 centimeters. The only Gorgonopsian with a larger skull is Inostrancevia, whose skull can reach a length of 60 centimeters. However, when taking width into account, Rubidgea's shorter skull is much more massive. It can thus be inferred it was at least as big as its more iconic relative, and may have even been the largest Gorgonopsian. Regardless, its robust and widened jaws were undoubtedly the most powerful of any known Gorgonopsian, with a bite force of 715 newtons. Indeed, Rubidgea's bite was stronger than that of any later saber-toothed carnivore. Outside of Gorgonopsia, the one that came closest was the saber-toothed cat Amphimachiridae giganteus, but even its jaws had only a third of the power of the far more ancient Rubidgea. Early synapsid predators had elongated, delicate jaws, but they became stronger over the course of the Permian Period. Although Rubidgea is the most extreme example of this trend during the late Permian, even it was overshadowed by the carnivorous dinocephalian Anteosaurus, which lived 10 million years before it. Dinocephalians have been the top predators of the Middle Permian, but were wiped out during the little-known Capitanian mass extinction, whose severity was on par with many of the more famous Big Five mass extinctions. It was this event which allowed the Gorgonopsians, who had previously been small carnivores, to quickly replace them, with Rubidgea coming the closest to matching Anteosaurus in raw power before Gorgonopsia's extinction at the end of the Permian Period. Rubidgea's distinctive appearance and exceptionally strong jaws were a direct result of its dramatically expanded post-orbital bar, widened squamosals, and flared cheeks. While most pronounced in Rubidgea, these traits were present in the rest of the Rubidgeines. Indeed, a few other Rubidgeines and their relatives also had more powerful bites than Inostrancevia despite being notably smaller. While not as obvious as from the front, Rubidgea's skull still differed considerably from Inostrancevia when viewed from the side. While Inostrancevia's skull has a simple, oval shape, Rubidgea's is instead more sculpted. Rubidgea also had a greater overbite than Inostrancevia. Likewise, it had large bosses above its eyes, which served as stress sinks when biting down. While most other Rubidgeines had smaller versions of these, Rubidgea had the greatest number of bosses among Gorgonopsians. A set unique to it are located on its mandible, which are convergent with those of Anteosaurus, although their function remains unknown. The brain cases of most sabertooths are compressed, but this trait is absent in Gorgonopsian skulls, with the Rubidgeines having evolved in the opposite direction. The postorbital region is particularly long in Rubidgea, providing yet another distinction between it and the more well-known Inostrancevia. The skulls of both Gorgonopsians were tall, making them more resistant to the stresses created by struggling prey and their own bite force. Many of their smaller relatives instead had lower skulls that were better suited for rapid strikes. Rubidgea's snout was also shorter and more bulbous than that of the more iconic Inostrancevia. The snouts of juvenile Rubidgea were shorter still, but proportionately taller than those of adults. As a result, their heads were wider than long. However, the postorbital region of young Rubidgea was smaller, resulting in a proportionally weaker bite. The skulls of juveniles are so different from the adult form that they were once thought to be a separate genus, Brumacephalus. They were even hypothesized to be ancestral to Rubidgea, as the layout of the sites they were found in were not recorded when they were described during the early 20th century. Like modern mammals, Gorgonopsians were heterodont, meaning they had multiple types of teeth. In Gorgonopsians, they are divided into long, serrated incisors in the front, followed by their saber-like canines, and then smaller post-canines in the back, not unlike the arrangement of saber-toothed cats. Quite unlike mammals, Gorgonopsians had simple teeth located on their palate. These palantal teeth were used to help hold on to prey, although their number was reduced in Rubidgea. It had 5 pairs of upper incisors and 4 lower pairs. The canines were located on the widest part of its already broad snout. The upper canines were longer than those of Inostrancevia and even the famous teeth of Tyrannosaurus rex, which are often referred to as killer bananas. As they extended past its lower jaws, Rubidgea's saber teeth would have been visible even past its lips. While not as long as the upper pair, the lower canines of Rubidgea and its closer relative Dinogorgon were greatly elongated compared to those of most other Gorgonopsians. As a result, their jaws had a lower effective gape, but were still within the range of many other saber-toothed carnivores, such as the saber-toothed cat Homotherium. This was because Gorgonopsians were able to open their jaws even wider than later mammalian saber-toothed predators. Gorgonopsian post-canines lacked the complexity found in their mammalian counterparts. Those of Rubidgea were also reduced in number, with only 1 to 2 pairs in the upper jaw and none in the lower jaw. Despite the power of its bite, without developed post-canines, Rubidgea was unable to crush bone. It would have also been unable to chew when feeding, instead simply tearing off and then swallowing chunks of flesh. The jaw musculature of Gorgonopsians was different from mammals. The force they generated was primarily derived from the upper jaw rapidly moving downward, with the lower jaw acting as the anvil to the upper jaw's hammer. This was why Gorgonopsians had even larger gapes than other saber-toothed carnivores. The power of mammalian bites instead comes directly from the muscles at the back of the jaws, with the size of the gape or speed at which the jaw closes having little impact on the strength of the bite. The power of mammalian bites is also strongest towards the back of the jaw, while that of Rubidgea and other Gorgonopsians was focused on the interior of the snout, where most of their teeth were located. Gorgonopsian jaws were adapted to bite deep into the flesh of their victims and then shear off flesh, causing extensive trauma. This hunting behavior has also been suggested for some saber-toothed mammals like Smilodon, although in their case, they are often thought to have targeted the throat, and then only after first subduing their prey. In contrast, Gorgonopsians like Rubidgea seem to have been less restricted in the use of their sabers. Unlike mammals, most early synapses replaced their teeth throughout their lives. The rate of replacement was fast in Gorgonopsians, and Rubidgea skulls sometimes have 2 pairs of canines, a consequence of one set being about to replace the other when the individual died. Although not as wide as the skull of Rubidgea, the eyes of all Gorgonopsians were positioned so they had overlapping fields of vision. Binocular vision allowed them to better judge the distance between themselves and their prey, and to possibly detect camouflaged animals. Since most Rubidgea fossils consist of skulls, understanding what the rest of its body looked like is dependent upon other Gorgonopsians. Unfortunately, no complete skeletons belonging to other Rubidgeans have been found either, so Rubidgea reconstructions usually fill in the blanks using the more distantly related Inostrancevia anatomy, since it was roughly the same size. However, since they belong to opposite branches of the Gorgonopsian family tree and evolved large size independently from each other, it is uncertain to what degree Rubidgea's skeleton actually conforms to that of Inostrancevia or other Gorgonopsians. Gorgonopsians had long, muscular necks. This trait is also present in the saber-toothed cats, although their necks were even more muscular, perhaps to compensate for their weaker bite force. Also, as in saber-toothed cats, their vertebrae had stiff vertical joints, restricting their range of side-to-side movement, but reinforcing the back, a valuable trait when handling large, struggling prey. Though not powerful weapons, the digits of their forelimbs were useful for grasping. Combined with their large shoulder muscles, Gorgonopsians were well adapted for pinning their prey before delivering their lethal strikes. Gorgonopsian limbs were semi-erect, intermediate between the sprawling early synapsids and the upright posture of mammals. Although Rubidgea would have been slower than its later mammalian analogues, fully upright gaits hadn't evolved by the late Permian. Gorgonopsians were capable of quick bursts of speed, but were not suited to pursue their prey for long, another similarity they shared with the later saber-toothed predators of the Cenozoic era. Much like their limbs, Gorgonopsian metabolisms were in between those of basal, ectothermic synapsids like Dimetrodon and the more active, endothermic mammals of today. Once again, this was not a great hindrance, as intermediate metabolisms were the norm during the late Permian. Predators like Rubidgea would not be competitive in modern ecosystems, but they were advanced for their time. Whether the metabolic rates of these synapsids were yet high enough to drive the evolution of insulating fur coats is still a matter of debate. The paleo-environments Rubidgea fossils are found in were once semi-humid floodplains. As in the modern African savannas, this environment would have been harsh during the dry season, but highly productive during the following wet season, leading to a diverse fauna. There are some differences between the faunas found alongside Rubidgea in Zambia, Tanzania, and South Africa, and as mentioned before, the Tanzanian Rubidgea may represent a distinct species, but the types of animals found in these formations are broadly similar to each other. Most of the local large herbivores were dicynodonts, a branch of synapsids with beaks that were toothless, save for 2 tusks. Among these was the stocky Cephalodon, which was to Rubidgea what Triceratops was to Tyrannosaurus rex. Another notable dicynodont preyed upon by Rubidgea was Daptocephalus. It appeared during the later half of Rubidgea's reign, and is the namesake of the Kauru's Daptocephalus assemblage zone. The preceding biozone was also named after a dicynodont, the small Cysticephalus. These sorts of small, burrowing dicynodonts were common during the late Permian, but they were unlikely to be major sources of food for large Gorgonopsians. Even during its juvenile years, Rubidgea's snout was too broad to have much success pilfering their burrows. Besides dicynodonts, Rubidgea also preyed upon the reptilian Paraeosaurus. Although not closely related to the synapsids, these reptiles had independently evolved semi-erect gaits and mesothermic metabolic rates. Large paraeosaurs are uncommon in late Permian African rocks, but they are the primary herbivores found in Russia, where large dicynodonts are rare. Whether synapsids or early reptiles, it was these herbivores that drove the evolution of Rubidgea's robust build. The herbivores of the early Permian had generally been smaller than their predators, whose jaws were primarily specialized for catching them. As the Permian progressed, this gap closed, requiring large predators to become faster and stronger to subdue their prey, with Rubidgea being one of the most extreme manifestations of this evolutionary trend from across the period. While the robust Rubidgea was the most powerful local carnivore, its fossils are found alongside an exceptional number of other predators. Gorgonopsians were the most successful large predators during the late Permian, and in South Africa, the most abundant were other members of Rubidgeinae, most of whom had skulls about 2/3 the size of Rubidgea's. Rubidgea was clearly the top predator, but how their ecologies differed from each other is otherwise unclear. One of these contemporary Rubidgeines, Inostrancevia, notably had the strongest bite force within Rubidgeinae besides Rubidgea itself. Indeed, Inostrancevia fossils were once mistakenly classified as a new species of Rubidgea. Another relative, Inostrancevia, was a bit smaller and had a narrower snout than most other Rubidgeines. One of Rubidgea's closest relatives, Dinogorgon, also had a short snout. Dinogorgon approached Rubidgea's body size, but had a weaker bite force and retained a full set of post-canine teeth. Rubidgea's other close relative, Clelandria, was the opposite of Dinogorgon. While smaller, its robust skull is almost like a smaller version of Rubidgea's and lacked post-canine teeth entirely. The snout of the Rubidgeine genus Psychosaurus was low and long, which combined with its small sabers is indicative that it targeted smaller prey. There are two known species of Psychosaurus, Psychosaurus lacatops, which lived in South Africa, and Psychosaurus nowaki, which lived in Tanzania. Another Rubidgeine, Ruhuhu cerberus, also lived alongside Rubidgea in Tanzania. Besides fellow members of Rubidgeinae, Rubidgea's ecosystem was also home to more distantly related Gorgonopsians, which were still more closely related to them than to the Russian Inostrancevans. These mostly consisted of medium-sized species, such as the meter-long Arctognathus and Lycanops. However, one of these Gorgonopsians, the particularly long-fanged Smilesaurus, possessed a size and bite force on par with the true Rubidgeines. Indeed, until recently, Smilesaurus was considered a member of Rubidgeinae. Of course, as mentioned earlier, a single member of the otherwise exclusively Russian clade of Gorgonopsians, Inostrancevia africana, did inhabit Africa. It is a distinct species from the northern members of its genus, but it was just as large, making it perhaps the greatest rival of Rubidgea. They are known to have coexisted in Tanzania, but the fossils of Inostrancevia africana in South Africa date to after Rubidgea's extinction. Finally, there were some small, basal Gorgonopsians such as Cyanosaurus. It had enlarged scleric rings, the bones which surrounded its eyes, indicating it was nocturnal, whereas those of the Rubidgeine Clelandria were instead small, suggesting it instead preferred to hunt during the day. Unfortunately, scleric rings are not preserved in Rubidgea and the rest of the contemporary Gorgonopsians. Although Gorgonopsians were the dominant carnivores, Rubidgea also lived alongside other meat-eating synapsids. Among these were Therognathus and the leopard-sized Muscarinus. They were therocephalians, a group closely related to Gorgonopsia, but even more so to the ancestors of mammals. Therocephalians had actually been large carnivores before the rise of the Gorgonopsians, but only small species survived the Capetanian mass extinction. While only the leopard to Rubidgea's lion, with a skull length approaching that of many Rubidgeines, Muscarinus represented an evolutionary shift back to their former status. The group ancestral to mammals were the cynodonts. While most Permian cynodonts were small carnivores and insectivores, the more robust Vetusodon reached a length of 1 meter, rivaling some Gorgonopsians like Lycanops. Finally, this predator-rich ecosystem was home to the Biarmosuchian Icengops, one of the most primitive remaining synapsids left during the late Permian. The Biarmosuchians of Rubidgea's time were small carnivores with highly developed domes and bosses on their skulls. That Rubidgea was able to coexist with so many other carnivores has shocked paleontologists. Such an abundance of terrestrial predatory species is rare both today and in the fossil record. During the end of the Middle Permian, the Karoo had previously been host to just one species of large carnivore, the Dinocephalian Enteosaurus. The greater diversity of Rubidgea's time was possible in part due to a difference between the ecosystems of the late Permian and modern ones. Permian ecosystems in general possessed a greater number of meat eaters compared to plant eaters. This was because the lower metabolisms of early synapsids, even the intermediate ones of the late Permian species, burned less energy than those of modern mammals. As such, they required less food, allowing for a greater number of predators to be supported by a given number of herbivores. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, much like the African Serengeti, the ecosystem of the late Permian Karoo had an unusually high amount of food available for the herbivores, which produced the greatest degree of dicynodont diversity in the fossil record. Such herbivore-rich environments can more easily afford to have a greater degree of niche overlap between carnivorous species. There was still niche partitioning, but it was not as strict as in other ecosystems. All of this allowed for an exceptional number and variety of predators. This diversity fell drastically at the end of the Permian Period, which was marked by a mass extinction more severe than any other since the start of the Cambrian Period, to the extent that it is called the Great Dying. It was caused by the release of volcanic gases, which led to higher temperatures, acidified oceans, a depleted ozone layer, and a crash in oxygen levels. Much of the fauna of the Karoo never saw the worst of the mass extinction, instead dying out as a result of the aridification at the onset of the catastrophe. The shift to a drier climate also caused a crash in dicynodont diversity, and thus that of the local Gorgonopsians, including Rubidgea's close relative Dinogorgon. Predators at the very top of the food chain are often the most vulnerable during extinction events, but Rubidgea managed to persist longer than most of its peers. Contrary to what was implied by BBC's Walking with Monsters, the earliest victims of the Permian mass extinction were mostly small dicynodonts, while most of the larger ones, like Cephalodon, Rubidgea's favorite prey, survived longer. However, as conditions became more severe, Rubidgea and most of the large herbivores it preyed upon finally disappeared. The only two African Gorgonopsians found after the extinction of Rubidgea are the small, non-Rubidgeine Cyanosaurus longiceps and Inostrancevia africana. The first African Inostrancevia fossils that were identified are dated to close to the end of the upper Daptocephalus assemblage zone, which led to the hypothesis that the otherwise exclusively northern Inostrancevia briefly spread all the way to Africa after the extinction of the native African Rubidgeines. However, not long after its discovery, older Inostrancevia africana fossils were found in Tanzania that were contemporaneous with Rubidgea. Instead, what appears to have happened is that when Rubidgea perished as the diversity of large dicynodonts contracted, this allowed the neighboring Gorgonopsian to expand its range a bit further into South Africa. It subsisted on the medium-sized dicynodonts Daptocephalus and Lystrosaurus mcagii. Though smaller than the sorts of animals the robust Rubidgea was specialized for, they were sufficient prey for the more generalized Inostrancevia. In the end, it was Rubidgea's power that led to its downfall. Inostrancevia africana did not find itself at the top of the now smaller food chain for long. As the volcanism of the Great Dying worsened, it, and most of its favored prey, died out. The role of top predator was then inherited by the therocephalian Muscarinus, who subsisted on Lystrosaurus, by which time few lived long enough to reach even half of their full size. They were both burrowers, and as such were already well adapted for the low oxygen and high carbon dioxide atmosphere of the Great Dying. Gorgonopsians had slower growth rates, but longer lifespans than Muscarinus or the other species that survived into the Triassic period. This had previously been viable due to the low mortality rate of Gorgonopsians and the stable ecosystems of the Permian, but such a lengthy juvenile phase was a liability during the unpredictable climate at the end of the period. Even if they had been otherwise better suited for these dismal conditions, life expectancy during the extinction event was simply too short for many of the Gorgonopsians to have a chance to reproduce. Out of the exceptional number of predators from Rubidgea's time, Muscarinus was the sole survivor. However, its newfound dominance over the depleted South African ecosystems was also short-lived, as it died out during a smaller wave of extinctions during the early Triassic, and the niche of apex predator became filled by the reptilian Proterosuchus, a distant relative of the dinosaurs and crocodilians. The extinctions which started with Rubidgea marked the end of the first age of synapsids, and the start of the Age of Reptiles. While often overlooked in favor of Inostrancevia, Rubidgea was the most powerful carnivore of its time. Its wider and robust skull allowed it to hunt larger animals, and created a distinctive appearance from the more widely known Gorgonopsian, Inostrancevia. The Gorgonopsians possessed a unique mixture of mammal-like traits and those closer to their reptile-like ancestors, while Rubidgea also converged upon some traits of the Dinocephalian and Teosaurids, the previous dynasty of large carnivores. It was the king of a highly diverse fauna for millions of years, but understanding its extinction has also helped scientists to better understand the progression of the most devastating extinction event in the last 500 million years. While its reign was cut short by the volcanic catastrophe, Rubidgea was one of the most dangerous animals before the dinosaurs. Thank you for watching, and a thank you to my supporters on Patreon, who chose the subject of this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the like button, and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more. If you'd like to support this channel more directly, you can join my Patreon, where you'll have access to polls to select the topics of future videos. Finally, be sure to have a great day.